and welcome to our continuing look at the readings assigned for now this third Sunday of Easter. Already we're moving through the Easter season, and as I mentioned last time, the general gospel guide through the Easter season is John. As we saw last week, we looked a little bit at the last 20th chapter, rather, of John's gospel. But on this particular weekend, we are looking now at the story found in the third gospel writer's work, Luke. So we're going to spend a little time today. And one of the kind of difficulties is we're just kind of taking a lot of things out of context, because as I mentioned earlier on, it's important when looking at the gospel traditions, whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, to kind of see the overall themes that each of these gospel writers has. And it tends to be a little bit different in emphasis for each one. Now, the gospel, of course, according to Luke, begins, as you remember, with two stories, or two chapters rather, which are known as infancy stories, and now comes to the end of the gospel tradition. But again, in looking at how we develop our liturgy, keep in mind that the pattern often used by Luke is the pattern used by our liturgy. So, for example, Luke will say that there are 50 days from Easter until Pentecost, and will include that on the 40th day, Jesus ascended into heaven. And so it is really only in the Gospel of Luke and in the opening chapter of Acts, which is also the work of Luke, and as we pointed out, it is the work that gives us the first reading throughout the Easter season. So Luke has a lot of influence in his own way in this particular writing. Now, I preface all of this to say that this weekend we look at the second part of the narrative that Luke presents with regard to the arrival of Jesus, the resurrected one. There are, in fact, three aspects to it. The first takes place early in the morning, when the women come to the tomb, find that it is empty, are greeted by two angels. Luke is always very careful to present things, if you read through his gospel, in pairs. Somehow he sees, and maybe that was a Roman idea, that if you have the testimony of only one, not that it's not true, but you obviously can be shaded by the person telling his or her story. So if you have two, your chances are better that you have accuracy. And notice that we like to use two. When you are baptized, we ask for two sponsors. That's the best way. When one is married, we have, obviously, even the state requires or asks that there be two witnesses. So this is a very, what we would call Roman idea, and Luke, we believe, kind of addressing his gospel to a fundamentally Gentile background, which would be a Roman background, likes that idea of two as kind of witnesses. Now, all that's a little aside to say that the women in the tomb, at the tomb, are greeted by two witnesses, namely two angels, and told a similar message that is found in the other Gospels. Go and tell Peter and the disciples that he will go before you to Galilee, and there you will see him. But in the Lucan story, the beginning of the Christian experience takes place in the city of Jerusalem. In fact, in the letter, in the work, Acts of the Apostles, that we are looking at on weekends, or this Sunday again, keep in mind that the opening 8 chapters of the Acts all take place in the city of Jerusalem. So it is there that Luke sees the foundational start of the Christian experience taking place. So all of that is to say that the women report to the disciples that Jesus is risen, They have encountered him, and the disciples give what is, I suppose, and you ladies would smile at this, say, so much nonsense do the women tell us, okay? Now also keep in mind in this gospel that women play a more extraordinary role than they do in the other gospels. So Luke, not that he's a feminist or anything like that, but he does certainly bring women into the story of how they are important disciples and members of the early Christian experience. So this is followed then. Now, so that's the first section, is what happens in the morning at the open tomb. This is followed by a narrative of two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and they encounter the risen Jesus. Now, that particular section of Luke's story is used not this year, but in year A, so it assumes, I think, that you carry over. You remember last year for the third Sunday? Sure you do. So we all do. But this picks up, and this is what we'll be looking at this week, that the two disciples recognize Jesus in the breaking of the bread and return to Jerusalem to report what they have experienced. And when they come to where the disciples are, they are greeted before they can even say anything that the Lord is truly risen, interestingly, not because of what the women have told them, but that he has appeared to Peter. That's interesting because there is no recorded episode of Jesus actually appearing to Peter alone. It is simply the statement of Luke here that this has happened. And now the two disciples returning give their account of what had happened when they were on this journey. It's at this point, and it's interesting to note now that you have a group kind of sharing the message that they have heard about the risen Jesus. The women's story, Peter's story, and now the story of the two Emmaus road travelers. So they are now talking about, it's interesting here, Luke sees the formation of the first community of believers. And they are talking about and reflecting on what it means to say that Jesus is risen. At this point, Jesus appears. And he appears and shows them his hands and his feet. Now, unlike the other gospel, he does not invite them to touch them but what will be kind of important, and this is a characteristic, by the way, of the Lucan gospel and of the Acts, that Luke is could say always too, I suppose, very practical in how he presents things. In order to capture the imagination and to help people understand something, it's not just good to theorize about it, but it is important to see things in a practical way. So, when Jesus appears now to those who are gathered together, wherever they are, we're not quite sure where this place is that they are gathered and discussing. John's gospel presents the upper room, but remember, John's gospel hasn't been written yet at this point, so wherever they are gathered, somewhere in Jerusalem, could even have been in some area of the temple, because that also remains a very important part of the Lucan scenario. And when he shows them his hands and his feet, the point that Luke is making, or that Jesus is making as Luke presents him, is that this is a real person. It's not a ghost. A ghost does not have wounds, does not have hands and feet. So in his appearance to the gathered community here, it is Jesus, and this gives rise to the fact that the early Christian community saw the resurrection of Jesus as a bodily experience. Jesus truly is who he had been, but he is different. And one will notice in all of the stories there's a certain wonderment and amazement And these, of course, are words that the gospel writers like to use with regard to Jesus' resurrection. And then he says to them, why are you afraid? He asks them a question. Why are you afraid and why do you doubt? Well, maybe that's because they did think they were seeing a ghost. See, keep in mind, and I mentioned this last time, no one expected the resurrection. Now, in telling the stories and in writing the gospel tradition later on, of course, this is the given belief that is the heart of the new movement. But to say that somehow there had been a prediction that Jesus would rise was not the case. I would suggest that it's a completely amazing, surprising, and in that way, disturbing experience. So why are they terrified? Why are they amazed? Why do they think they can't believe what they are seeing? Or, as the gospel writer says, why do they doubt? Because maybe it's their imagination. Maybe they would like to think that Jesus is alive, but is not really. So Luke now will make sure that Jesus establishes the reality of a bodily resurrection that is his by asking them the question, do you have anything to eat? Well, again, one of the characteristics that you may notice in the Lucan stories is always the fact that Jesus, when he gathers with many different people, is pictured as being at a meal. And so when he asks, do they have anything to eat, is really challenging a little bit, again, the quality of their hospitality. Because if this is Jesus really, shouldn't they be doing, remember, isn't it when grandparents are visited by grandchildren, how often does grandma say, would you like something to eat? It seems that it's the normal, the necessary, the natural expression. So hospitality is a built-in quality in a certain way, and certainly was an important quality in the lifestyles of the Mediterranean world. So in a kind of little way, Jesus is saying to his disciples, gee, you didn't even offer me anything to eat. So he has to ask, and they say, well, we really weren't expecting you. Or they don't say that, but you can see that. So what do we have left over, guys? What do we have? Oh, here we have a little salted fish. Here, Jesus, welcome. Now, the fact that he eats it in front of them, in their presence, indicates, and he says, and think about it, ghosts do not eat. They don't need food. So the fact that here is the real person, really Jesus risen, is very, very important. So now that they're somewhat assured that this is really Jesus, he now does what is a part of the reading, again, that we continue to hear this weekend, talks about the fact that a pattern that actually you saw already in the first story where the Emmaus visitors, remember they didn't recognize Jesus at first, and he asks as they're going along, what were they talking about? And they say, are you the only one around in Jerusalem that doesn't know what happened? And he says, what? And they say that this Jesus, who we thought was the Messiah, who we hoped was the Savior, has been crucified, died. And we heard this morning, and there again they come back to this, some women reported to us that they had seen him, that he had been risen. Well, Jesus then goes on to explain to those two disciples that it was necessary that the Messiah would have to suffer, die, and be raised. Jesus now does the same thing with this new community that has been gathered, and these would be the words that we will hear as we listen this time. In fact, the pattern that Luke pictures is that he presents Jesus as speaking as a prophet. Now, this is a major image. I may have mentioned this before. A major image in the synoptic tradition, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but Luke particularly sees Jesus as a prophet. Remember, A prophet is a spokesperson for someone else, but Jesus is the spokesperson for God. But a prophet also practically, and this is where I may mention this, practically knows what we would say today, how to put two and two together. If you notice this and you notice this, then it's pretty much going to be the case that such and such a situation will develop. That was the role of the prophets in Israel, and that is the role of Jesus as the prophet of the New Testament, of our Christian scriptures. If one listens to his teaching, if one looks at the actions that he is doing, putting those, if you want, two things together, can see and understand who Jesus is and what his mission is. And so Jesus says, "Do you not realize then that it was necessary that the Messiah would suffer, die, and be raised from the dead?" He speaks, was he, and here's where we use the word prophesying, speaking of some future event. Yes, but at the same time, practically, if, as I mentioned, you paid attention to all of those details, Jesus is saying, you might have noticed that this is what happened and why it did happen. But because of this, we can believe that Jesus truly is the Messiah, the promised one, the Savior, the Son of Man, and the Son of God. So he is leading this little group who have had different experiences with regard to the resurrection, forming, as it were, a new community, a community of believers, a community who will need one another. The resurrection, therefore, will shed new light, and this is what the words of Jesus indicate, new light on his death, on his words, and on the scriptures itself. So all of this is what kind of is offered for our consideration this time. Now, Jesus parting, the last sentence in the gospel that we will hear, says that he advises this new community to remain in Jerusalem. Something is yet to happen. Something is going to be very important. And Luke is setting us up for the great coming of the Spirit on Pentecost. So now, in the meantime, Luke introduces, and as I may have mentioned, this concluding part of this chapter, which we're not going to be hearing in church this weekend, because what immediately follows are two more verses where Jesus takes the disciples outside and is pictured as ascending. It is in Luke's accounts that the image of Jesus' ascension are developed. And so we're going to save those two verses for the 40th day when we observe the ascension. In fact, Luke ends his gospel with Jesus ascending and begins the Acts of the Apostles with an even more developed story of the ascension. So this is one way in which he links things together. I mention here again that there is what we call remember, Luke Acts account, that in this story, as Luke presents it, there are really two parts, and they are integral to one another. The first part, of course, is the narration about Jesus and his activity and his teaching, and then in the second part, how this continues in the work of particularly Peter and Paul, but in the work of all of the apostles. So the kind of points now that maybe we can just quickly draw from the readings of so far is the practicality that Luke illustrates. Jesus eats. He's really shows them that he has flesh and blood hands. The universality of the message, that this message that the disciples who are gathered together have received is not just for them, but it is for everyone. And this is a characteristic that flows also into the Acts of the Apostles. Well, how do you bring the message of the risen Jesus to everyone? Well, you're going to need men and women dedicated to that mission, to carrying that quest on. So there is the Lucan Gospel. We might quickly look a little at the Acts account. The Acts today come from chapter 3, as we mentioned, and then they kind of break it up, verses 13 to 15, verses 17, verses 19. I'm not quite sure why they drop out certain verses. If you want to get the full flavor of this, go read Acts out of your New Testament and see how they all fits together. Well, what happens here is that, interestingly, it's a story in which Peter and John are on their way to the temple. Temple is very important in the Lucan story, and is as their custom, they're going at, apparently they had different times of the day in which they would pray. They're going to the temple to pray at 3 o'clock. And as they're going along, there is a beggar there who is doing what I suppose beggars do, hold out his cup, hopes that there's something. And Peter says, "Gold and silver we have not, but what we do have, what I do have, I give you. In the name of Jesus, rise and walk." So as they're getting ready to enter into the temple, not Peter, who heals the sick man, but exercises this power that had been given to the disciples, the power of the Spirit to heal. And then in another characteristic of Lucan's work, when good things happen, people are always jumping around. So this man not only gets up and walks, but he jumps and leaps, and that, of course, gets everyone's attention. And that's another little characteristic. How do you get people to notice what's happening? Do something that gets their attention, right? And that's what prophets used to do, little actions that got people's attention. Well, here Peter and John get the attention, certainly, of others by what the healed man does. So this then, because people want to know, well, what's going on here? How has this happened? And Peter says, now given his opportunity to not give another little sermon. Now I say, this is his second sermon, because you will immediately say, but when was his first sermon? Well, his first sermon is given at the time of Pentecost, which is in chapter 2. This is chapter 3. So the Acts somewhat follow sequentially as Acts develop, but they want to save chapter 2 for Pentecost. So you get, as I mentioned, a little bit of jumping around here in the way in which Luke's material is used. Now, this is a rather thorny issue in the early church. Why would God's quality of being able to be healed given to one who had been crucified? And so this is really the gist of what Peter begins to say here in this little homily or little sermon, that the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has conferred on Jesus this great power to do good things, to bring healing. And remember, it's the audience that is pictured as saying to Peter and John, what's going on here and why are you doing these things? And now Luke carefully does not lay the blame for Jesus' death. Remember, this is an issue that needs to be understood, but he does lay the blame for Jesus' death on fellow Israelites. Now, not all Jews, remember, Peter's a Jew, John's a Jew, so this is not a question of them and us, but it's them and them, okay, or us and us. So this is something that's happening within the Jewish experience. But even though some of our sisters and brothers have turned against Jesus, allowing his death to happen, God has vindicated Jesus. And so the fact that he has raised Jesus up is something that we all can share in. The gift of resurrection is not just for a few, but is for everyone. And in fact, Peter here in this little talk that we'll hear gets them off the hook by saying what they did in ignorance, as did their rulers, that they should have known better, but they didn't. And so God does not hold that against them. Because, and here's where kind of the Lucan thinking comes into play, because, says Peter, God had all this in mind anyway. And this has been revealed, and here now is the connection I made a little bit earlier. All of what God is doing has been revealed through the prophets, through all the prophets. Well, there's a bit of hyperbole there because not all of the prophets did this, but some of the prophets. And so even in this little section in Acts 3 that we're looking at, notice some of the titles that are given to Jesus, kind of nice titles. God's servant, the holy and righteous one, the author of life. So Luke kind of creates, as he unfolds the story of the early church in the Acts, wonderful titles that are given to Jesus. But they are titles then by extension that also believe in all, or belong to all rather, who believe in Jesus. So this is the little homily that Peter is giving to those who have witnessed, which is the raising up of a man who couldn't walk. One of the characteristics, just as an aside here, is that in the Acts of the Apostles, you have three main figures. We'll see this as we move along through the weeks. Three main figures who are very kind of center everything. Jesus, certainly in the gospel, Peter and Paul in the Acts. The first part of Acts are almost inevitably stories about Peter, with one exception. And the second part of Acts is all about Paul, with one exception, just so that. But what Jesus was able to do, Luke sees Peter and Paul as being able to do. So remember how Jesus had early on healed a man who was a paralytic and who couldn't walk? There's a story when he was brought into where Jesus was, carried by four of his friends there. Well, if Jesus can enable someone who couldn't walk to walk, here's what Jesus had done. This crippled man who was begging, Peter allows to walk. So that's kind of little, what we would call carry through what Jesus had done, Peter. And later on, if you read in Acts, Paul also enables a man who can't walk to walk. That again is a device of Luke. So this will be really our opportunity this weekend to look at the Lucan works, to remember the themes that are very important to Luke. Practical, that Jesus is a great prophet, but that the glue that holds things together, in a gospel that stresses again and again the compassion of Jesus. What should be the compassion of the early Christian experience? And another word for compassion is certainly forgiveness. So this is an important, not that it's not found in the other Gospels, but it is particularly stressed in the Lucan work. And so Jesus is pictured as always, what does compassion mean? To feel with, always forgiving, and hopes that his community who hears his word will follow his example and his message. Thank you for being with us. We'll hope to see you again.